You're someone who doesn't believe in impossibility. I read your first speech as Secretary General of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. You talked about getting a global deal, how impossible that would be, but in a sense was a wake-up call to yourself. As an attitude, nothing's impossible.
Yeah, I guess it has become sort of a maybe a trademark or something. I don't know, but it was a huge wake-up moment because the first press conference that I faced as I took over that responsibility, a journalist asked me, so do you think that a global agreement will ever be possible? And of course we were all still reeling from Copenhagen disaster. And I said, not in my lifetime. And as I said that, I realized that is something that I cannot accept as a possibility, because if that were to be true, the negative consequences of that would be so horrific, particularly on the most vulnerable people in every country, that I just couldn't accept that I would be a part of that world. So I immediately realized, right, I have to change my attitude about this, and I have to help everybody else change their attitude. And we're going to move here from what seems impossible, too complex, too costly, and too late anyway, which is what most people told me, to making it possible. How, we didn't know, and I think that's the important thing. We didn't know how it was going to be possible. But I have grown to understand that optimism is not the result of an achievement, it's the necessary input for any achievement. That's the shift.
Well, certainly optimism we need now when you look at the present.
Yes.
God. But I was there that night in 2009, sitting there in that huge conference centre, Copenhagen, and probably like many in this space, it took me quite a few years of, I'm not joking, sort of psychological counselling to get over that.
I happen to think that while the enabling context for the Paris Agreement before 2015 was provided by corporations and subnational governments, giving federal governments the possibility to come to the agreement, I think that we're now in the reverse situation. And I think that now at the center of the action is no longer federal governments who have already said, right, this is our framework, this is our pathway over the next few decades, but who are really moving into the center of the action are enlightened corporations, enlightened private sector leaders, enlightened public sector leaders at subnational levels, right? Governors of states, mayors of cities, heads of small communities that are they have really understood, they being a particular subsection of that entire universe, right? So you cannot expect that everyone who's a mayor will have understood. But you do have 9,000 mayors around the world who have understood this. And you cannot expect that every CEO has understood, but you do have 800 CEOs that have said, right, we understand, A, that this is in our interest, and B, that we have to do something about it in order to have a more stable planet, and frankly, in order to have stable clientele, because if they don't have clients, what are they going to do? So I think it's very interesting the fact that while in many countries, some of which you've just named, the heads of state or government are in a complete blind spot with respect to climate change because of the issues that are on their plate right now, and some of them because they put climate on their plate in a negative sense. I think it's quite fascinating that there is this upswell of other leaders in other sections that have taken up the banner and said, right, we're going to move forward. And that's what the California Summit is all about, right? That's where we're going to see that amazing array of leaders from all different sectors and at all levels that have understood that this is their opportunity, not only their responsibility.
This is a summit next week in San Francisco that Governor Jerry Brown has called, which is, again, is fascinating. So I think most people, will have heard that President Trump is pulling the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but probably not as many, probably many of them don't know that the states, companies, ordinary US citizens, governors of states, mayors, cities are stepping up and actually trying to compensate for that by ensuring the United States meets its Paris obligations. And I've heard that the summit next week is a kind of almost a US level meeting of the parties, of all of those players to sort of bring that action together.
Well, that's not the way we designed it or planned it, because we've been planning this and designing it and preparing it for 2 years. It was always meant to be a global climate action summit, although it was my preference for it to take place in the United States for very evident reasons. But because of what has happened in the past 2 years, the focus of the summit has actually shifted, and what has been very interesting is how many US-based private sector and public sector leaders are banging on the doors saying, I want to come. I want to come, I want to be on stage, and I want to make it very evident that there is no such thing as the United States exiting the Paris Agreement. One thing is if the White House exits, which I now call the dark house because their lights are not on, that's one thing, if the federal government exits, but the real US economy has not exited, quite to the contrary. And so, for good or for bad, I think the Climate Action Summit in California has turned into being a very US focused summit that it wasn't intended to be. It was intended to be much more global. So I'm still hoping that we will get a critical mass of global leaders there, as well as the United States, because that was the whole intent. You cannot put the burden of addressing climate change on any one country, even if that one country is the United States. That is just completely irrational and doesn't solve the problem. So, it remains to be seen, but I am quite surprised about the determination of US-based leaders to be in California and stand up for what they know to be the right thing.
So we've got all that action and we've got this commitment, but again, bringing it back to most ordinary people, how do we make this relevant? I mean, the organisation that I run and I'm part of, Carbon Tracker, we've had some limited success in making this relevant to our audience in the financial markets by essentially translating the...
Okay, I'm going to disagree with you now, because I don't think it is limited success. I think you have been incredibly successful in really cementing the whole concept of stranded assets and the danger with that in the financial community, and increasingly in the political community, right? The problem, of course, is that climate is so complex that while it's getting very, very hot in Europe, it's also getting colder somewhere else, and next year, it could vary completely, and we'll have a very cold Europe. So it's not only about warming and about fires, right? It's the disruption of the natural patterns of climate, and that's a little bit difficult for people to understand. If we were dealing simply with, let's call it, linear increase in temperature everywhere all the time, and that's the only thing we're dealing with, that would be much simpler to explain. But it's not, right? We're dealing with a disruption of a very carefully balanced and very intricate system that is being threatened in that balance. And so the imbalance expresses itself in many different ways. And so that makes it very difficult to explain to anyone.
Well, I also think many people do respond. It registers, but if you don't offer, for most people in their daily lives, immediate, concerns, the bills, children, schooling, do I have a job? If you don't offer
what they can
solution,
do,
what they can do, they will switch off, because it's a psychological protection mechanism. You need those two things. So maybe let's drill into that. So we've got the hope. You're the architect, one of the drivers of this amazing agreement, which many of us thought we would never see after Copenhagen, the Paris Agreement. So we've got...
Shame on you, Anthony.
Oh, I'm very pleased to see it. And you're one of the people who gave me hope we would achieve that. That enthusiasm.
And you helped enormously for that now.
Well, thank you. But now, obviously, as we say in this country, the proof is in the eating, the proof is in the pudding. How do we now deliver that? Your initiative now, Mission 2020, is all about bending the emissions curve down, getting us on that pathway as soon as possible to avoid a disruptive transition. I mean, are we winning?
Well, both yes and no. I think we are winning on the energy side, and thanks in huge part to the work of Carbon Tracker. I think we're winning, as you know, also thanks to Carbon Tracker on electric vehicles, on transportation. So those two sectors, I think, are the ones that are pulling us forward into this transformation. We're increasingly winning on the financial side, because also thanks to the work of Carbon Tracker, I think the risks of putting your capital into increasingly risky assets is becoming clearer and clearer. So I would say those three sectors are, for me, the three that are pulling forward this transformation. Who is far behind? Land use, very far behind. We are not doing on land use what we should do, and it is 30% of the problem. It should be 30% of the solution.
Yeah.
So we have a big problem there. We also have a big problem with heavy industry, or what we call heavy to abate sectors. Steel, cement, all of those heavy transport, also long distance transport. All of those sectors that seem to be still very, very attached to their intensive carbon fossil fuels. And those are the sectors that, if you're in a sailboat and you want to sail free, those are the sectors that are the anchor and that are not allowing that sailboat to move with the speed that it should. So I'm grateful to those who are very specifically working on those sectors to move them forward, because as soon as we can get a critical mass of actors, and a critical state of progress in those, then I think this is totally doable.
Which I think brings me to my final question, probably where we started. In light of that, in light of how late we've left it, in light of how little time, 2 years, we have to sort of bend the curve down, get on that pathway, are you still optimistic?
I am, for the very simple reason that none of us can afford not to be. I mean, do we have the luxury of not being optimistic, right? Especially if you understand that optimism, as I said in the very beginning, is the input to do anything. It's not the result. If you're only optimistic about the things that you have achieved, then I ask you, so what's the big deal? Fine, you already achieved it, then how is that an added value? Optimism as a force of change is an added value, or is a force of change, only if it is the input to the effort that you're about to engage in. And on climate, we don't have any other option but to do what we have to do. So anybody who works on climate that is not optimistic, please, turn the lights off, go home, because the rest of us will continue forward. Because you cannot work on climate change and not be optimistic, because you're not going to get anywhere, nowhere. And we just don't have that option anymore. We don't have that luxury. We've just got to do it.
So you could say
optimism by force.
So if you could say one thing, not to those in our climate world, but to the guy or woman in the pub, taverna, coffee shop, noodle house, whatever, the ordinary person who's watching this video, who doesn't really know much about, climate change, the Paris Agreement, what we need to do, what would it be? What would be the one key message takeaway?
I think the one message is how we all have to become more aware of the intrinsic energy that is in every aspect of our lives. And we just take that for granted. We don't see it, right? We don't realize that when we transport ourselves, we're using energy. We don't realize that when we eat, we're using energy, the energy that is embedded in our food. We don't realize that when we don't pull the plug from all of our 1,000 devices at night, we're using energy, right? We are using energy constantly. And we don't realize that. We don't realize how much energy we're using. And we certainly don't realize the quality of that energy. So the first step is become more aware of the energy that you're consuming. The second is reduce that and increase the quality of your energy. And it's not difficult to do. Honestly, it's just a question of changing the mental chip, right? And thereby contributing. Having said all of that, Anthony, I firmly believe that consumers have a role to play, but I think the major weight of this transformation is in corporate, financial, and government hands, because we no longer have the time for an exclusively bottom-up transformation. We have to have the bottom-up, but we most certainly have to have the top-down. And my, vision is that eventually none of us will even have the option of being irresponsible about energy. We just won't have the option because all our homes will be smart, right? Mm-hmm. And all the energy that is coming to the house, in fact, all the energy that is produced by my home has to be clean energy. And every single kilowatt of energy that I use has to be smart about when it's being used and how it's being produced. So by the time we make those systemic changes, right, then we can begin to forget about energy again, because we will have pervaded the solution into the energy system. But in the meantime, consumers need to be much more aware of that and demand the changes.